What would you do if your husband walked out of your own party without a word, only to return with a lawyer? I thought I was being playful when I flirted with the man next door. My husband's silence that night was the beginning of an ending I never saw coming. My name is Thalassa Gray. I am 34 years old, and I still cannot believe how fast everything changed after one stupid night. We were hosting a party at our house. Friends and neighbors gathered in the living room with music, food, and drinks. I thought it was harmless fun to laugh a little too much with Ryan, our neighbor, leaning closer than I should and letting him whisper things that made me smile. Daniel, my husband, noticed and tried to pull me aside, asking me to stop. I brushed him off in front of everyone, told him he was overreacting, that he was insecure. People laughed, and I felt powerful, admired. But then he did something I did not expect. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He just picked up his coat and walked out of the party in silence. I stayed behind, pretending it was nothing, still talking and drinking, but that door closing behind him was not just the end of a night. It was the start of something I could not control. The night of the party had been my idea, and I wanted it to be perfect. I spent the whole day setting out glasses, laying snacks on the table, and arranging candles so the house would feel warm and inviting. I told myself that hosting was a way of showing how lively and popular we were, though, honestly, it was more about proving I could still turn heads. Daniel helped with the heavy lifting, carrying in extra chairs from the garage, but he did it quietly, without complaint. He always faded into the background at times like these, steady and boring, while I sparkled. I wore a short silver dress that caught the light and styled my hair in soft curls. When the first guests arrived, I made sure to be the one at the door greeting them with laughter. Soon the house was filled with voices, clinking glasses, and music drifting from the speakers. Our neighbor Ryan came a little later, and I felt a thrill the moment he stepped in. He had this easy smile, the kind that made people want to stay close, and I knew right away he would give me the attention I craved. I made sure to refill his drink myself, brushing against his arm as I passed him the glass. Daniel was nearby, setting out more ice, and I caught his glance. It was tight, uneasy, but I ignored it. Ryan made a joke about how hosting must be exhausting, and I leaned closer to tell him I enjoyed it when the right people came over. He laughed, and I liked the sound of it more than I should have. As the evening went on, I found excuses to keep near him. When a group gathered around the living room, Ryan and I sat side by side, our shoulders touching lightly. I laughed louder at his jokes than anyone else, and when he complimented my dress, I told him he always knew what to say. Daniel was across the room watching. Later, when I stood in the kitchen topping off drinks, Daniel followed me in. He asked quietly if I realized how close I was sitting to Ryan. I told him not to be ridiculous, that it was just fun. He said people were noticing. I rolled my eyes and told him he was imagining things. He said it wasn't imagination, it was disrespect. That word stung, so I turned it back on him. I told him he was insecure, that he should be proud other men admired me because it only showed he had chosen well. He shook his head and said it wasn't about pride, it was about respect. I waved my hand and walked back to the living room before he could say more. Once I returned, I leaned in closer to Ryan on purpose, making sure Daniel could see. The music grew louder, people danced in little clusters, and I moved with Ryan for a moment, laughing when he spun me around clumsily. Some of the neighbors smirked, others whispered, but I pretended not to notice. My mother, Helen, who had stopped by earlier, gave me a wink and whispered that men always overreacted, that I was just having fun. My brother Tom, however, pulled me aside once and asked if I had lost my mind. He said Daniel looked miserable. I told Tom to stop being dramatic, that Daniel was fine, that he was just shy. Tom's face hardened, and he said quietly that humiliation had a breaking point. I brushed him off and went back to the crowd. By then, Daniel had withdrawn to the corner of the room, speaking little, sipping his drink with that heavy silence I knew so well. I hated that silence because it made me feel judged. I raised my voice and made a joke about how some men couldn't keep up with me, how they didn't know how to have fun. People laughed awkwardly, and Ryan grinned, clapping me on the back. Daniel's eyes darkened, but he said nothing. I expected him to argue, to cause a scene, so I could accuse him of being controlling. But he didn't. He stood, put his glass on the table, and without a word, walked to the door. The room went strangely quiet as he pulled on his coat. I tried to laugh it off, told everyone he was just tired, but I knew from the stillness in his movements that it wasn't just that. He opened the door, stepped outside, and closed it behind him. No slam, no raised voice, just finality. The sound of that door clicking shut lingered in the air. Ryan raised an eyebrow and asked if Daniel was always so serious. I shrugged, trying to look unbothered, and said he was sensitive, that he didn't understand my sense of humor. A few people chuckled, but the mood had shifted. The whispers started almost immediately, little glances and half-hidden frowns. My mother told me not to worry, that Daniel would come crawling back after he cooled down, but Tom stood by the window with his arms crossed, his expression grim. I poured myself another drink, pretending I didn't care, but inside my chest tightened. I wanted to believe Daniel's exit was just a sulk, that he would return after a walk and act like nothing had happened. Yet deep down, the way he had left, so silent, so deliberate, felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. And though I kept smiling, laughing, and leaning into Ryan, I couldn't shake the unease that something irreversible had just begun. The morning after the party, I woke up with a dull headache and the memory of Daniel leaving without a word. His side of the bed was untouched, and his coat was gone from the hook by the door. For a moment, panic bubbled in me, but I pushed it down. I told myself he had probably stayed at his parents' house or gone for an early run. I made coffee, checked my phone, and found a string of notifications. People had tagged me in photos from the night before. There I was, leaning close to Ryan, laughing too hard at something he said, my hand brushing his arm. Another shot showed us dancing in the living room, while Daniel stood in the background, stiff and unsmiling. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it wasn't a big deal. People always exaggerated. I called my mother, Helen, and told her Daniel had walked out. She chuckled and said he needed to grow a thicker skin, that men always sulked when women enjoyed themselves. She told me not to apologize, that I had done nothing wrong. Her words were comforting, so I repeated them to myself like a shield. But when my brother Tom called later, his tone was different. He said he had watched me humiliate Daniel in front of half the neighborhood. He said I crossed a line and that I was playing a dangerous game. I snapped back that he didn't understand marriage, that Daniel was too sensitive. Tom sighed and said Daniel was stronger than I thought, that silence was not weakness. His words unsettled me, so I hung up quickly. That evening, I went to dinner with Cassie and Dana, wanting to drown my unease in laughter. I told them Daniel had overreacted, that he couldn't handle harmless flirting. Cassie rolled her eyes and said men were all the same, jealous and dull. Dana was quieter, fiddling with her glass. I noticed her hesitation but ignored it. I told them Ryan had been charming, and that I liked feeling admired. I laughed, saying Daniel should be proud to have a wife other men wanted. Cassie agreed, but Dana said softly that respect mattered more than attention. I brushed it off, claiming she was being old-fashioned. I felt in control again, the center of attention, until I noticed two women at a nearby table looking our way, whispering. One of them had been at the party. I caught a fragment of their words, something about poor Daniel, and my face burned. I laughed louder to cover the sting, pretending I didn't hear. Over the next few days, Daniel didn't return home. He called to check on the kids but didn't speak to me. When I tried to call him back, he didn't answer. I told myself he was pouting, trying to make me feel guilty. I sent him a message saying he was overreacting, that he needed to come home and stop acting like a child. He didn't reply. I complained to my mother again, and she told me to ignore his silence, that he would crawl back once he realized he couldn't manage without me. I believed her because I needed to. At the same time, the gossip spread. At the grocery store, I felt people's eyes on me. Neighbors waved politely but with forced smiles. Ryan, of course, didn't mind. He stopped me in the driveway one afternoon and joked that I was the star of the party. He said Daniel had always been too uptight. I laughed and told him Daniel just didn't know how to handle a woman like me. Ryan grinned, and I liked the way it felt, even as a part of me knew the neighbors were watching from their windows. When Daniel finally showed up at the house one evening, I thought it meant he was ready to reconcile. I greeted him with a smirk, asked if he was done sulking. He didn't take the bait. He only asked if I realized what I had done to him at the party. I said I had done nothing wrong, that he was imagining slights where there were none. He said quietly that everyone had seen. I told him that everyone thought he was weak for walking out, that he had embarrassed himself, not me. His eyes darkened, but he didn't shout. He only said that I had made my choice clear. I tried to laugh it off, but something in his tone chilled me. Later, I called Cassie and told her Daniel was being dramatic. She told me not to worry, that men always threatened but never followed through. Dana, though, didn't answer my call. That silence worried me more than I admitted. My brother Tom showed up at the house a day later. He said Daniel had been at their parents' place, calm and steady, and that he was talking to a lawyer. My stomach dropped, but I told Tom he was lying. Tom shook his head and said Daniel wasn't angry anymore, which was worse. He said anger faded but decisions lasted. I shouted at him to leave, but his words clung to me long after he was gone. That night, I scrolled through the photos from the party again. The images looked different now. My laughter too forced, Ryan's grin too smug, Daniel's silence too sharp. I told myself it was still harmless, that Daniel would get over it. But deep down, I felt the crack widening, the silence growing heavier. And when I went to bed alone, I realized for the first time that Daniel's absence didn't feel like a sulk anymore. It felt like a plan. A week after the party, Daniel finally came back to the house, but only for dinner with the children. I thought his return meant we were going to fix things, so I dressed nicely and set the table as if everything was normal. He arrived with a calm face, carrying a bag of groceries, and greeted Emily and Jonah warmly. He kissed them on the head, asked about school, and helped them with their plates. He barely looked at me. That made me furious. I tried to pull him into conversation, asking if he was still upset about the party. He said calmly that it wasn't about being upset, it was about respect. I laughed and told him he sounded like a lecturer, not a husband. He replied that a husband deserved respect in public and private. His tone was steady, not angry, and that unnerved me more than shouting would have. I told him he was being dramatic, that everyone flirts, that it was just a joke with Ryan. He asked if humiliating him in front of neighbors counted as a joke. I said he was paranoid, that people barely noticed. He looked at me and said, "People noticed everything." The children sat quietly, their forks scraping the plates, aware of the tension. I told them Daddy was just tired and that Mommy was joking, but Daniel didn't smile. He tucked Jonah into bed later and read Emily a story, all without including me. When he left that night, he said he would see the children soon, but didn't say a word about me. I slammed the door behind him and told myself he was sulking again. The next day, I tried to take control of the story. I met Cassie for coffee and told her Daniel had no sense of humor. I said he wanted to control me, that he couldn't handle a confident wife. She agreed at first, saying men were fragile. But when I showed her the photos online, even she frowned. She said it didn't look good, that people might get the wrong impression. I snapped at her, said if she couldn't support me, she shouldn't say anything at all. Cassie grew quiet after that, and I realized even she was slipping from my side. My brother Tom, on the other hand, was harsher. He came to the house unannounced and told me straight that Daniel was gathering evidence. He said neighbors were talking, that people had seen everything at the party. I told him gossip didn't matter. He said it did when lawyers were involved. His words made my stomach churn, but I still refused to believe him. I said Daniel was just trying to scare me, that he didn't have the courage to go through with it. Tom shook his head and said Daniel didn't need courage. He needed clarity, and he had found it. After Tom left, I called my mother. Helen told me not to listen to him, that Daniel wouldn't risk breaking up the family over something small. She said men always threatened divorce but never followed through. I clung to her words because they were all I had left, but a part of me wondered if she was wrong. That evening, Daniel returned again, this time with folders under his arm. He sat at the table while the children played in the living room. I asked what the papers were, and he said they were financial documents. I laughed and asked if he was planning to audit me. He said he was preparing. I told him he was being ridiculous, that marriage wasn't a business. He said calmly that I had already turned it into a public performance, so now he was treating it like one. His quietness made my skin crawl. I tried another tactic. I told him the children needed us together. He said the children needed stability more than they needed parents pretending. I said he was exaggerating, that I was a good mother. He nodded but said being a good mother didn't erase being a disrespectful wife. My cheeks burned at his words. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out hollow. He placed one of the folders on the table and left it there as he stood to leave. I flipped it open after he walked out. Inside were printouts of photos from the party, comments from neighbours, and even a note about me mocking him at the restaurant with friends. My throat tightened. He was documenting everything. I slammed the folder shut and told myself it was just a tactic to scare me, but deep down I felt something shift. Daniel wasn't sulking. He wasn't bluffing. He was building a case. And for the first time, I realized his silence was not weakness. It was preparation. By the time the second weekend rolled around, the whispers in the neighborhood had grown louder. At the grocery store, I noticed two women from down the street glance at me, then lean in to whisper while their carts clinked past. At the playground, one father nodded politely, but avoided small talk like he used to. Even Ryan seemed to enjoy the attention, greeting me with a smirk whenever we passed in the driveway. He once joked that Daniel must be fuming still, and I laughed too loudly, though inside it stung. The children picked up on the tension as well. Emily asked why Daddy wasn't home much anymore. I told her he was busy with work, but she frowned and said he always used to tuck her in. Jonah asked why people looked at me funny at the store. I snapped at him to mind his own business, then felt guilty afterward. I blamed Daniel for putting me in this position, for making me look bad, but part of me knew I was the one people were talking about. I tried to reclaim control by attending a neighborhood cookout. I wore a bright dress, smiled wide, and chatted with everyone as if nothing had happened. Ryan hovered close, making comments that kept me laughing, but I caught the looks people exchanged, half smirks, raised brows, silent judgments. Daniel didn't come. His absence was louder than my laughter. When I got home, Tom was waiting on the porch. He said I was embarrassing myself further. I snapped back that he was supposed to support me, not Daniel. He said he was supporting the truth. He told me Daniel had already spoken to a lawyer about custody and finances. My stomach turned, but I said Tom was exaggerating. He shook his head and said Daniel wasn't angry anymore. He was focused. I slammed the door on him, but his words stuck like thorns. Later that night, my mother called. She told me Tom was poisoning me with fear and that Daniel was bluffing. She said no man would throw away a family over a little flirting. I clung to her words, repeating them until they sounded hollow. A few days later, I found a business card on the kitchen counter. It belonged to a local law office, with Daniel's handwriting on the back. Appointment times, notes about custody, dates circled. I froze, staring at the card as though it were a weapon. When Daniel came home that evening to see the children, I waved the card in his face and demanded to know what it meant. He said simply that it meant he was moving forward. I told him he was heartless, that he was trying to destroy our lives over nothing. He replied that I had done that already at the party. I shouted that Ryan meant nothing, that it was all just fun. He said the neighbour's eyes told a different story. I told him he was pathetic for caring what others thought. He said respect wasn't about neighbours, it was about us, and I had thrown it away. I tried to twist it, telling him he was abandoning the children. He replied calmly that he was securing them, not abandoning them. His certainty rattled me. At the next family dinner, the divide became clearer. Helen sat beside me, repeating her line that Daniel was making a fool of himself. She told everyone I had done nothing wrong. But Charles and Marion, my in-laws, kept their distance. Charles said softly that respect was not negotiable. Marion agreed, saying she had raised Daniel to endure many things but not humiliation. The children sat confused at the table, their little eyes darting between the adults. The silence grew unbearable until Tom put down his fork and said outright that Daniel was right to act. Helen snapped at him to be quiet, but the damage was done. The room fell into cold silence. When we returned home, Daniel gathered the children's school bags and placed them by the door, ready for the next day. He didn't even acknowledge me. I demanded to know if he was really going to follow through. He said he already had begun. I shouted that he would regret it. He looked at me steadily and said regret was already part of the house, but it wasn't his. Then he left again, folders under his arm, leaving me trembling with anger and fear. I poured myself a glass of wine and told myself it was still a bluff, that he would never risk the family. But when I opened the drawer where I had shoved the business card, I saw another paper tucked beneath it. It was a printed schedule with court dates circled in red. My hands shook as I held it. This was no bluff. Daniel's silence wasn't weakness, it was resolve. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized the party hadn't just been a mistake. It had been the start of the end, and he was already halfway to finishing it. The moment it became real was a Tuesday morning at work. I was sitting behind my desk, checking emails, when a man in a dark suit walked into the lobby and asked for me by name. I thought he was a client or maybe a vendor, so I smiled and stood up. Instead, he handed me a thick envelope and said I had been served. My co-workers turned their heads immediately, eyes following me as I froze with the papers in my hand. My cheeks burned, and I tried to laugh, saying it must be some mistake, but my voice shook. I hurried into the break room, clutching the envelope, and ripped it open with trembling fingers. Inside were divorce papers with Daniel's name across the top. Attached were copies of photos from the party, screenshots of my social media posts, and even statements from neighbors who had witnessed me leaning on Ryan while Daniel stood in the background. There were notes about how I mocked Daniel at dinner with friends, and even a mention of what the children's teachers had noticed. Emily asking why her father no longer came home, and Jonah saying people looked at his mother funny in the store. I felt the room spin. When I returned to my desk, my co-workers were pretending not to watch, but I could feel their curiosity like a spotlight on me. I stuffed the envelope into my bag and kept my eyes glued to my screen, though my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't type. That evening, I stormed into the house and threw the papers onto the table in front of Daniel. I demanded to know how he could humiliate me like that, serving me at work, making me look like a fool. He replied calmly that I had already humiliated myself, and he had simply chosen the legal path. I shouted that he was cruel, that he was tearing our family apart instead of fixing it. He said the marriage had been broken the moment respect was gone, and that he was protecting himself and the children. His voice never rose, and that composure unnerved me more than anger would have. I tried to twist it again. I told him he was selfish, that he was abandoning the children by doing this. He answered that he was doing the opposite, that he was securing stability for them. He opened a folder and showed me custody plans already drawn up, visitation schedules, and financial protections. I accused him of turning everyone against me. He said I had managed that myself. Desperate, I called my mother, Helen, and cried that Daniel was trying to ruin me. She told me it was a bluff, that no judge would take away my children over some harmless flirting. She said men always threatened but never followed through. Her words were shaky, but I clung to them. When I called Tom, though, his tone was sharp. He said Daniel wasn't bluffing, that he had already seen the lawyer and had every document lined up. He said Daniel was more prepared than I could imagine. I screamed at him for betraying his own sister, but he only said I had betrayed my own family. That night, I tried reaching out to Cassie. I told her I needed her to back me up if things went to court, to say it was all harmless fun. She hesitated, then said she didn't want to be dragged into legal matters. Dana didn't answer my calls at all. Even my allies were slipping away. When I looked at the children, I could sense their confusion. Emily clung closer to Daniel when he was around, and Jonah avoided my eyes when I asked him questions. I told myself they were just picking sides because Daniel spoiled them, but deep down, I knew they were reacting to what they had seen. The next morning, Daniel handed me another envelope. Inside was the official schedule for hearings. Court dates were set, documents stamped, everything in order. I stared at the papers, my stomach twisting. I asked him if he was really going to go through with it, and he said simply that he already was. I told him he was destroying us out of pride. He answered that it wasn't pride, it was dignity, and that once dignity was gone, nothing else remained. He picked up his bag, kissed the children goodbye, and walked out the door with the same calm he had shown since that night at the party. I sat at the table, clutching the papers, realizing that my laughter and excuses had no power anymore. Daniel had chosen silence, evidence, and law, and that spoke louder than anything I could say. The courthouse felt colder than I expected, even though the sun outside was bright. I walked in clutching my bag, telling myself it was just a formality, that I could still talk my way out of this. Daniel was already there, sitting straight in his suit beside his lawyer, a woman with sharp eyes and a neat stack of files. He didn't glance at me when I sat down across from him. That hurt more than any glare could have. I had no lawyer because I still believed I could charm the judge, explain it all away as harmless. The judge entered, and the session began. Daniel's lawyer spoke first, laying out the story piece by piece. She presented photos from the party, where I leaned too close to Ryan, while Daniel stood humiliated in the background. She handed over screenshots of my posts, where I bragged about being admired and mocked my husband for being boring. She read out statements from neighbors who witnessed the scene, from friends who described me laughing at Daniel in public, and from the children's teachers noting their confusion and sadness. Every page stacked higher, every word sharper. I tried to interrupt, saying it was all taken out of context, that everyone joked, that social media wasn't real life. The judge looked at me, unimpressed. When it was my turn to speak, I told the court Daniel was exaggerating, that he was controlling, that he couldn't handle me being fun. My voice echoed too loud in the quiet room, and I hated the sound of it. Daniel's lawyer asked if I had posted those words myself. I admitted yes. She asked if I had ignored Daniel's messages and walked away from him in front of friends. I admitted yes. She asked if I had laughed at him when he asked me to stop flirting. I admitted yes again, but insisted it was just a joke. The judge raised an eyebrow and asked if humiliation was a form of humor in my marriage. I couldn't answer. Behind me, my mother Helen sat stiff, her lips pressed tight. She had always defended me, but even she looked drained now. She didn't speak, didn't smile, just stared at her hands. Across the room, Tom sat with Daniel's parents. He didn't even glance at me, only nodded once when Daniel's lawyer finished presenting. That nod was like a dagger, because it meant he fully stood with Daniel now. When the judge summarized, my heart pounded. She said Daniel had demonstrated steady, respectful behavior, while I had engaged in public disrespect and neglect. She said his preparation showed responsibility, while my defense rested only on dismissing my actions. She approved his request for divorce, secured his financial protections, and granted him primary custody of the children, with visitation rights structured for me. The words slammed into me like a door shutting. I wanted to argue, to cry that it was unfair, but the judge had already signed the documents. Daniel reached for the pen and signed calmly, his hand steady. When the papers slid toward me, my hand shook so badly that I smudged the ink. I whispered that we could still fix this, that it didn't have to end. Daniel finally looked at me then. His eyes weren't angry, only tired. He said quietly that respect couldn't be rebuilt once it was broken. Then he stood, shook his lawyer's hand, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. I sat frozen in my chair, staring at the empty space he left behind. Around me, the court carried on with other cases, as if nothing monumental had happened. My mother touched my arm weakly, whispering that I should stay strong, but her voice lacked conviction. Tom didn't approach me at all. He walked out with Daniel and the in-laws, his shoulders firm, his loyalty clear. When I finally stepped outside, the air hit me like a wall. Daniel was standing on the courthouse steps with his lawyer and his parents. They spoke quietly, their faces calm, united. I wanted to call out to him, demand he turn around, but no sound came from my throat. He walked away with them, steady and sure, while I stood rooted to the spot. Passers-by moved around me without a glance. I clutched the folder of finalized papers, the weight of it unbearable. My mother stood beside me, silent now, offering no excuses, no comfort. Everything I had once believed I controlled, my marriage, my family, the story people told about me, was gone. Daniel had chosen silence, evidence, and the law, and in the end, that quiet strength was more powerful than all my laughter and all my games. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.